At this time, we're going to have our keynote speaker come up. We've been waiting this whole afternoon to hear her speak. And again, it's just such a privilege. We really have a lot of good, strong presenters on the roster today. And again, so great to have them here with us. She is a fourth-generation descendant of African black settlers that left Alabama via Texas, via Oklahoma, and settled in Amber Valley and Campsie in northern Alberta. Her mother's family is also migrated from Oklahoma and settled in Maidstone, Saskatchewan. So she completed her high school in Barhead and then moved to Edmonton, where she completed her graduate studies. She also, in 2005, October 2005, Deborah and 3 other descendants formed Black Settlers of Alberta and Saskatchewan Historical Society, the BSAS. Please welcome her to the podium.
First of all, can you hear me okay? I'd like to thank everybody for coming, and after sort of being at the end of following all these other great, the entertainment and speakers, I hope I can do justice to this. I'm not an academic or a presenter or anything, just kind of formed a society and kind of fell into doing this sort of thing. So I'll just, it's kind of an informal thing, and it's a little bit of the story of how my ancestors arrived. The Black Settlers of Alberta, Saskatchewan Historical Society is a non-profit group, and we were formed in 2005 by 4 women, all of whom are descendants of Black American slaves and Black Canadian pioneers. We started the group to document and share the unique history of the early pioneers in Canada. The story of the Underground Railroad to freedom is fairly well known, and the settlements of the Blacks in the Northwest Canada is not. Initially, the Blacks left the southern states seeking freedom from oppression and bigotry, even though slavery had been outlawed via the Emancipation Proclamation announced by President Lincoln in January 1863. This new legislation didn't necessarily improve the life of the former slaves and their families. Once Oklahoma Territory officially became a state in 1907, the Jim Crow laws were enforced, and once again, Blacks were forced with the oppressive laws of the Deep South. Blacks were still looking for their promised land. As the conditions for the Blacks deteriorated, it was then the Blacks answered an advertisement by the Canadian government to come to Canada and settle in the Western Plains. The campaign targeted mostly white Europeans, but little did Canadian officials know that Southern Blacks would answer this call. Many Blacks came to Western Canada and formed all-Black communities in Amber Valley, Alberta, Amber Valley, Breton, Campsie, Wildwood in Alberta, and Maidstone in Saskatchewan. There were also there was also people that came to Edmonton and Calgary and stayed in the urban areas as well. The migration of the Black pioneers into Canada, arriving in northern Alberta and Saskatchewan, took place from about 1907 until 1912, when the borders were unofficially closed to Black immigrants. I will briefly examine the incredible journey of Willis Bowen and the Willis Bowen family, who left Evergreen, Alabama, went to Wortham, Texas, from there to Wellston, Oklahoma. Following a 3-year stopover in Vancouver, they finally made their way to Amber Valley, Alberta, arriving in 1913. It typifies the route taken by those who migrated to both Alberta and Saskatchewan, albeit their port of entry to Canada may have been different. The Bowen family history is very well documented by my great aunt, Willa Bowen Down, in her memoir entitled Memories of My Father, the late Willis Bowen. Willa was the third child born to Willis and Jeannie, and she was born June 13, 1897. At the time of the family's arrival in Canada, she was approximately 12 years of age, and she recalls the hardships and triumph of the journey to Canada. My great-grandfather, Willis Bowen, was born in Greenville, Alabama, on February 6, 1875. He met and married his wife, Jeannie, who was born in Evergreen, Alabama, January 10, 1875, which is approximately a 10-minute drive from Greenville. It is here their first 5 children were born, one of which was my grandmother, Amy. They left Evergreen for Texas, where they thought to be, because they thought it would be less oppressive than Alabama. This provided not to be the case. In their time in Texas was short-lived. The next move was to a farming community, Wellston, Oklahoma. Here conditions for blacks were more tolerable, as Oklahoma was still a territory. Blacks acquired property, farmed, and for the most part prospered. They were able to exercise their rights, such as voting, and their children attended school, albeit a segregated school. However, when Alabama acquired statehood in 1907, the hatred Jim Crow laws were enacted, thereby subjecting them to what they had supposedly left behind. It was then blacks began to look northward to Canada, answering campaigns launched by the Canadian government for Southerners to come and settle in the Western Plains. The government did not know that the black Southerners would answer this call, therefore creating a flurry of negative excitement at the Canadian border. The government officials quickly invented policies which included detainment while subjecting them to strict medical exams and proving they had a substantial amount of money to sustain themselves and their families. In spite of the negative actions and reactions on part of the government, our family and about 300 other families made their way across the border and settled in Amber Valley, Breton, Campsie, Wildwood. Others made their way to Saskatchewan, in Maidstone, North Battleford, and Roseland. Some families remained in Edmonton and Calgary. The Southerners who came west chose to come to Canada. They were indeed confronted with racism, shrouded in new laws, but found this less overt than they had experienced in the South. They overcame the barriers placed on them and realized the situation they now found themselves in was better than what they had originally left. They came seeking that all too exclusive freedom. In the words of a gentleman from Amber Valley, we just wanted a place to call our own. Perhaps most importantly, they did not want their offspring to experience the hostile environment they had left behind. Willis Bowen was known to his children as Papa. Members of his family celebrated his 100th birthday, February 16, 1975. He passed away October 21st, 1975, just a few months before his 101st birthday. He had been a resident of a nursing home in the town of Athabasca for a number of years prior to his death. A 3-acre parcel of land of the original homestead is still owned by one of his grandchildren. 2 members of our group were very fortunate to have the opportunity to travel to Buxton, Ontario in September of 2010 for their annual reunion. And then I continued on to Halifax for a few days. It is at that time that I realized that there was a significant difference in the arrival of blacks in the West Ontario Buxton area of Nova Scotia. And I would like to just briefly reflect on this. The blacks in the West left the South seeking a better life, whereas many blacks arrived in Eastern Canada via the Underground Railroad, which, as I said before, is a story most people are familiar with. Some of the first blacks to arrive in the Buxton area was in about 1850, and there was a small group of freed slaves brought by an abolitionist, Reverend William King. These people were allotted a piece of land which they could purchase over 10 years, I believe, and I believe it was the cost was $2.50. On which they had to build a house, plant a garden, etc. They were given specific guidelines as to how the house had to look. There's a museum down there that shows a replica of the house. It had to have 2 rooms, and they had to have a fence and plant a garden and things, so they were able to sustain themselves. Most of the blacks coming to Amber Valley and other areas in Western Canada, the land was advertised for $10. Most of this land was in isolated areas away from the major centers, which had to be cleared by hand before they could even build a home. I recall hearing stories of my great-grandfather, James Moses Beaver, living in a dugout. When we visited a museum in Birchtown, Nova Scotia, they had a replica of a dugout that was covered with trees. I wonder if this is similar to what my grandfather built. This was the living quarters for a family. Cooking was all done outdoors, even in the winter. It was essentially almost like a crawl space covered with logs. And if you were fairly tall, you couldn't even stand up for what I could see. The Buxton area is a farming community where descendants of these blacks still live and work the land of their ancestors. Buxton has been hosting a homecoming event for 80+ years and is attended by people from all over, from far and wide. We were fortunate to be able to participate in this event and experience the hospitality and visit the museum and learn about the rich history. In the Western settlements, very few of any descendants remain in these areas, as they have moved on to larger centers to continue their education and employment. Although I know very little about the history of blacks in Nova Scotia, when I visited there, I was fascinated by the history of this area. I'm not a researcher, as I said before, and VSAS's mandate is as an oral history project, but I did do a bit of research on Nova Scotia before going there. It has been documented that the blacks have been living in Nova Scotia since about the early 1600s, with an influx in the 1800s, and settled in 12 areas, and at one time had the largest population of blacks in Canada. There were 4 main groups of people that settled there. There were slaves, loyalists, refugees, and the Maroons, and many of them arrived from the U.S. on crowded ships from Africa, many from Sierra Leone. In the early years, blacks were brought as laborers, such as the Jamaican Maroons who built Halifax's Citadel Hill. Others were brought as slaves against their will. In later years, they came for opportunities for advancement and saw Nova Scotia as the promised land, same as they saw Alberta in the West, which is how blacks that arrived in the West thought as well. The common thread for these people is that they all had ties to Africa. Unfortunately, many blacks had a long, hard struggle and faced many challenges, including poverty, due to inability to get land, housing, work, and work that paid wages. In some cases, blacks were compensated with rations rather than money. Segregation was another barrier that blacks faced in the East. A little known part of Canadian history. Many left and went back to Africa. For some it was their choice, but for others, such as the Maroons, they were faced to leave. I had the opportunity to meet Sharon Robert Johnson, who is a descendant of the blacks that settled in the Yarmouth area in Nova Scotia. She has written a book called Africa's Children. In reading this, I have done some reading, and it seems that blacks have had a difficult time finding their place due to the various forms of bondage and discrimination. But in spite of these setbacks, the blacks in Nova Scotia were instrumental in building the roads and making Nova Scotia what it is today. They have formed their own churches, cultural centers, and many have become well-recognized individuals in society, such as lawyers, judges, teachers, politicians, and many other occupations, in spite of their history. I was able to hear about Nova Scotia's Black history firsthand by attending a couple of local events and meeting people in the community. I visited 2 areas just outside of Halifax, which are predominantly Black. East Preston is a rural sort of area where the East Preston United Baptist Church is located, and I was able to attend the 178th anniversary service. An amazing experience. This is one of the areas that the blacks were placed years ago, and my understanding of the area is that many of the residents are still living there on the land which their forefathers claimed many years ago. It seems the land is not sold, but passed on to the next generation, which is quite different from the people in the West. In many cases, more than one family lives on the land. North Preston is an area where many of the residents of Afrikan were relocated. Afrikan was once a community that was mostly populated by the blacks of African descent, until they were forced to leave in the early 1960s when the city of Halifax wanted to expand it into an industrial area, and a new bridge was built. This is still a contentious issue among some of the local blacks, and there is still a lone resident living there that has refused to leave. North Preston has its own schools, church, and medical center. I also visited Shelburne and Birchtown Museum, which are 2 other areas that blacks settled and lived. One of the largest collections of the Black history in the province is the Black Cultural Center for Nova Scotia, which is located in Halifax. I toured the facility and spoke to the curator, Dr. Henry Bishop. I know that there are blacks living in all areas of Halifax, but it struck me that the North and East Preston are predominantly black. This poses a question. Is this by choice, or is there still a form of segregation? In conclusion, after having the opportunity to travel to Alabama, Buxton, Ontario, and Halifax, Nova Scotia, all in 2010, I recognize that there are distinct differences in the migration of the blacks in the early 1900s to Western Canada, who left the U.S. freely for a better life. They settled in isolated, underdeveloped areas away from major centers. The blacks in Buxton settled in 1849, were brought by British abolitionists and placed on a parcel of land, instructed on how to build their homes and maintain their lands. Many of the blacks came to Nova Scotia in the early 1600s and were brought there against their will and were faced with many obstacles. Sadly, racism is still alive and well in 2012, but in all cases, the descendants of the people who settled in these distinct areas have gone on to be successful contributing members of our society.